This is our teaching video for the fourth Sunday of Easter. If you want to follow along in the scriptures in preparation for Sunday, and you'll recognize this as Good Shepherd Sunday with some of the texts, we have Acts chapter 2, 42 through 47. This is some of the early Christian community gathered around the gift of the resurrection, and we might even say inspired by the gift of the resurrection. We also have 1 Peter 2, 19 through 25. Peter talks about suffering unjustly for the sake of Christ in the model of Christ, and what it meant that we were sheep who went astray, but then were brought back by the redeeming love of Christ. And then we have the very famous section from the Gospel of John, where Jesus talks about being the gate through which we enter and find rest. Now, the Gospel of John is famous for a lot of I am statements, and of course, if you remember, I am is the name that God gives to Moses. So when Jesus says, I am something, I am the bread of life, I am the good shepherd, he's telling us God's name and then giving us some way to understand who God is. So we might call that in a positive, like Denver, the Mile High City. I am the good shepherd. I am the bread of life. And in this case, Jesus says, I am the gate. Now, I've made videos in the past about sheep, and if you want to get more into sheep, you can certainly look at one of those. We'll just look briefly at this image of Jesus as the gate, and then we'll talk a little bit about what it means to belong to the flock. And we're going to spend more of this video talking about community in Christ. Well, here you see on your screen a replica of a sheepfold from the time of Jesus. And so you can imagine a shepherd who is out in the fields and doesn't have a cave or even a stone sheepfold. Could make one of these out of brush. And you'll find different ones. You'll find those made out of stone and brick as well. And what you'll notice is the sheep can only get in through one part of the sheepfold. There's only one door or entrance. And the practice of the shepherd then was to place his body as the gate. So if anyone's going to come in or out, they have to do it through the gate, which is the shepherd. And of course, if you're a predator, the predator will have to fight the shepherd to get to the sheep. Jesus tells us that there are others who will try and get in the sheepfold, and there are others who will try and lure the sheep. But really, the proper relationship is Jesus the shepherd, the sheep who hear his voice. But we do have to beware of both the wolf, who comes to eat, and the thief who comes to destroy. And so that's a warning that Jesus gives us in John 10, that it's not as if we are just sheep living in a danger-free world. There's plenty of danger, and there are plenty of those who would like to see the sheep destroyed. And so part of being safe and part of finding our way is by listening to the shepherd who both guides and protects us. Now, like I said, you could go back to some other teaching videos and see more imagery about sheep in the time of Jesus and the way that the sheep were marked and the way that the shepherd worked with them. But now I want to talk about two activities. One activity is what happens inside the sheepfold. One activity is what happens outside the sheepfold. And with that, we're going to talk then about community of the church, or church as community. And then we're going to explore a little bit more what that means. So if we have the sheepfold, like I just showed you, that's essentially a circle just with a gate, where the shepherd would be the gate, and Jesus saying, I am the gate. We have activity inside the sheepfold, and that's potentially primarily resting. The sheep are brought into the sheepfold for rest and for protection. So the shepherd protects them by bringing them into this place. Now the sheep are brought outside of the sheepfold for grazing, for sustenance. So the shepherd during the daytime takes them out and lets them graze, lets them eat, lets them exercise and drink and so on. But then at night, or when the danger comes, the shepherd puts them in the sheepfold where they might rest and be protected. We might say then that as it relates to Christian life, we need both the in and the out. We need to be both in the sheepfold, protected by the shepherd. And so we could say this is where we have protection, but also where we have rest. It's important that you have rest in the Christian life. And then also we have the outside, where we might find sustenance, or where we might be fed. Now, interestingly enough, this being fed could also be connected with the mission of the church. So that in fact, as we're about God's work, and as we're about God's mission, we are finding ourselves being sustained, but there are also times when we need to gather together and find rest. You might imagine that the gathering of the church, then, is this gathering, where we literally gather in this reserved space where we might be rested and even protected. Sometimes people say, well, I don't think I need the church. I don't have to go to church. And I think when you miss out on the church, you miss out on this important element of being gathered by the shepherd and being brought to a place where you can hear his voice and become familiar with it, so that when you're outside, you're able to hear where he leads you as you go. Sometimes this is the problem people have. They go out of the church and then they're not really sure, what is it God wants me to do, because they haven't been tutored in recognizing the voice of the shepherd. This is a person I want to introduce you to. His name is Jean Vanier, and he's the one that began the L'Arche movement. I talked a little bit about this on the Wednesday nights in Lent. And L'Arche was something started in the 1960s, where Vanier went to France and began just a little community of himself and some disabled people. It was the idea of just living together, learning to trust, learning to have a meaningful life beyond just your individual life. And so that movement now has become international. And in fact, here's a picture from a L'Arche community in a church, and they're telling a parable, and it's everyone together. And it wasn't meant, or it wasn't started really idealistically. It wasn't started with the goal of making an international movement. It was started very humbly. How is it that people can live together? How is it that people can learn to trust and recognize the contribution of others and be with people who are different? And then out of that, a community forms, and out of that, growth comes. And so the reason I'm lifting this up to you is, over the weeks of Easter that remain, I want to talk each Sunday a little bit about what that looks like and what that means, because I think that's a question we're interested in our church. Not only what does it mean to come together as a community, but what does it mean to grow? And we don't just mean grow numerically, but literally to grow in a meaningful way. Every individual has to grow, and so how do we find ways to do that? Well, without getting into too many details, one of the principles that Vanier talks about is community for me, and then myself for community. So we might have said the top one could have been community for myself, and the bottom one, myself for the community. This is usually the entry point. What can I get out of this? What am I getting out of this? What are they providing for me? What services do they have? What do they do that I like and that I take something away from? And that's just the entry point probably of any human community. What do I get? But part of the necessary transition that takes place is not now what do I get, but what do I contribute? What is it that I have that I want to offer? What gifts do I have? Where are places that I can use my energy, my time, my money, and likewise? And so we want to talk about this transition happening in what we see in the book of Acts. Now, Acts 2 is very famous because it lifts up 4 things that people do and the effect that it has. So it says they dedicated themselves to the apostles' teaching. And so the apostles are the sent ones, the ones that Jesus sent. To fellowship, to being together, learning to be together in the resurrection community. Breaking bread, I think we can understand this sacramentally, but also just eating together. So I think it works in both ways. If you imagine the church time as devoted to the apostles' teaching and the breaking of bread at the Eucharist, we also then have social time for fellowship and breaking bread, just food, and then finally prayer. Understanding that the life we share is divinely inspired. So church is not a community that we shape by ourselves. Christianity is not something we do by ourselves. It's a gift that we receive and grow into. And so prayer means opening that space where in fact we can be united to God, in communion with God, and then in communion with one another. So these are the 4 things that we see in Acts chapter 2. And a lot of this being shaped to serve the community happens in these 4 touch points. And in fact, one of the things about Acts chapter 2 that sometimes surprises people together, it says, all who believed were together and had all things in common. So they believed together, and they held possessions in common together. Now, sometimes people get uncomfortable reading that because they wonder if the book of Acts is supporting a kind of communism or Marxism. And we have to say that this is all happening long before a lot of the political ideologies that were developed in the last couple hundred years. But we do have to be respectful of the text to say, why were people so generous with their possessions? Why is it that they were taking care of others? And actually what you'll notice is not very long after this chapter in Acts, the community breaks down. We have people who pretend to give all their possessions but don't really, Annas and Sapphira, and then more conflict happens in the community. So the community is not just the idealism of Acts 2, it's also what happens after. So here's the goal, and here's the shape of the community, but what happens when we fail at that? And that becomes an important question for the church. What happens when we fail at that? But I think we can say that in believing together and holding their possessions in common, they're living in this second part, myself for the community. These early Christians who are touched by the power of Easter are asking themselves the question, all right, if this is what God has done for me, what now do I do for others? And that becomes the fundamental foundational question for each of us to ask. If in fact the growth of community happens as individuals grow, then individuals have to be committed to this question. And they have to be committed to this work of the teaching of the apostles, the fellowship we share, the breaking of bread, and prayer. In conclusion, let's just take a moment then and consider what we hear in 1 Peter. Because if you're listening to what I'm saying, and if you start to really reflect on what does that look like, and in fact, if we start to live this out, we know there's going to be suffering. And so Peter talks about suffering when you do the right thing. Now, Peter says, look, if you suffer because you did the wrong thing, namely, you're being punished, well, what do you expect? I mean, that's what happens to everyone. But what happens when you do the right thing and you suffer for that? It's the other word we'll hear used is unjust suffering. Now, this is, a lot of our lives are filled with unjust suffering. There are a lot of things that happen to us that we either can't explain or we say, gosh, that shouldn't have happened to me, and we're right. And so what do we do with this unjust suffering, and what do we do when that unjust suffering is a result of doing the right thing? So what happens when unjust suffering becomes connected? So we'll just kind of connect the dots here to Easter. What happens when the power of Easter frees us, and then the fruit of that can be unjust suffering? That can be really shocking, and that can be discouraging. And so Peter says, speaking on this very thing, if you endure when you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval. For this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so you can follow in his steps. So we have to be able to say that when the power of Easter causes us to do the right thing and leads to unjust suffering, you have God's approval. You may not have the world's approval, you may not have the approval of your friends, even your family, but you have God's approval, and something new can happen, and God can work with that. Now we have to say it's not because you're going out and seeking to suffer, or you're creating situations. You're just living out your life of faith, and this is kind of the fruit you receive back. But you have God's approval, says Peter. And he finishes with a beautiful thought related to this theme of shepherds. For you were going astray like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. As we gather then this Sunday, that shepherd and that guardian calls us. And he calls us to both work, resting, finding protection in him, and also sustenance and eating and grazing and living outside the church, and through that mission finding the deep meaning of our lives. And so think about that. Is your life in balance that way in terms of resting and following the shepherd where he calls? Do you recognize his voice? And then also, what does it mean to grow more deeply into the Easter community, which is the church? We'll see you on Sunday.